it's a great honor to be asked to give the inaugural lecture in this Ibn Arabi series, and looking in the context of the Wolf Institute at relations between religion and society and the idea of oneness. I want to look at it through a very particular perspective, you will not be surprised, of the museum and what it means for the museum to present works that are to do with religion, with different religions, and how that has changed over the last 30, 40 years, and why it has now become such a difficult and problematic and important subject. The title, Faith in the Museum, has that double meaning. Not just how does the museum deal with works of art that were designed to strengthen faith, but also how does the way it approaches that question affect the way the public has trust, has faith in the organization. And I want to start with what seems to me the most profound shift in that relationship that's happened over the last 50 years and has certainly changed the task of the museum. I want to begin in 1975 with one of the great images of the Soviet Union celebrating Yuri Gagarin's first manned flight into space 14 years earlier. It was, of course, the triumph of Soviet scientific material advance. And it sums up, in a way, the way the whole world, I think, felt about science, advance, technology, and religion and society in the early 1970s. Gagarin, as you see, has gone to heaven, quite literally gone to heaven, thanks to Soviet science and technology. And looking around, he says, Boga niet, there is no God. I can't hear God. And below, on the earth, you see toppling gently the towers and spires of the Muslim and the mosque and of the churches. Science has literally risen above technology and above religion, and it's going to be the future of the CCCP, which is of course the Cyrillic for Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. This is the future. That was 1975, and it's extraordinary how quickly that whole thing shifted. And it shifted, I think, absolutely, we can name the day, at which this idea that religion was going to fade away and a new world designed based on science was going to take its place. And that day was the 1st of February, 1979, when the Ayatollah Khomeini returned to Iran. And in a way that had been, I think it's fair to say, unimaginable, politics became absolutely dominated by religion in many different areas of the world. Religion became center stage in how peoples defined themselves and how politicians defined peoples. From now on, the idea of an increasingly secular world, which had been, I think, the general assumption from the Second World War until the mid-1970s, was clearly under a threat, attack, or going to dissolve, whichever way one likes to look at it. And if you want to measure the distance that we've covered since that first portrait of Yuri Gagarin in 1975, that first manned space flight, we can see it, I think, brilliantly in another Soviet, Russian space flight in October 2007. In this manned space flight, one of the astronauts was a Malaysian Muslim. And this flight took place in October 2007, partly in Ramadan. And it was decided it was critical to establish what should a devout Muslim do to observe Ramadan and daily prayers in space. How do you pray in a low-gravity environment? How do you know where Mecca is if you're going round? And if you have to fast from dawn till dusk, then in his world, that's 90 minutes. So how do you observe Ramadan? And the Muslim Council produced an 18-page guidebook, which I do recommend. It is absolutely fascinating. Guidelines for performing Islamic rites at the International Space Station. It's an extraordinary journey to come. It's now taken for granted that the religious is part of the scientific again. That divide is closed, or, if you like, that it's politically impossible to ignore the religious requirements of more and more people. Those two space flights are, I think, extraordinary demonstrations of how things changed and how quickly. And this has happened right across the world. We've been in the Soviet Union. This is 1931, when Stalin orders the destruction of the Church of Christ the Saviour in Moscow, part of the anti-clerical drive of the Soviet Revolution across the whole of the Soviet Union. That, as you know, ended with the collapse of the Soviet Union. A return of Russia, no longer the Russia of Muslim Central Asia, but the Russia of old Holy Russia. A new identity for Russia had to be found, and that new identity is a religious identity. And on the same site, the church has been rebuilt. These two images are the same, 60 years difference. The new Soviet Union, the old Soviet Union, has given way to Christian Russia. And this is in Moscow, in Petersburg, the Cathedral of Our Lady of Kazan, which had been turned into the Museum of Religion and Atheism, with the emphasis on atheism, was given back to the Orthodox Church and is now once again a functioning cathedral. The secularization of the 1930s completely abandoned, and the leader of the state making enormous public statements about his own faith. Here we have Epiphany in January 2018. It's a standard practice in Russian and Ukrainian Orthodox churches on Epiphany to immerse yourself completely in the ice-cold water. And so here you see President Putin, that famous chest with the musculature we've all admired, a cross round his neck, immersing himself ritually in the icy water north of Moscow, in front of the icons that are about the divine protection of Russia. And you don't need me to remind you what a large part this notion of Russia plays in the war in Ukraine, that they are one holy Russia that should belong together. And it's not just Russia. In Istanbul, the great church, the great mosque of Hagia Sophia, the 6th century church, which has always been the theatre of state religion for the Byzantine Empire, and then became the theatre of state religion after the Islamic conquest of 1453. The Mosque of Hagia Sophia is turned by Ataturk in 1934 into a museum. The same date as Stalin is blowing up the churches in Russia, Ataturk turns Hagia Sophia into, from a mosque into a museum, the symbol of secular Turkey. And it remained the great symbol, if you like, again, the theatre of state religion, this time a secular religion, until the 24th of July, 2020, when President Erdogan, read surahs from the Quran and led prayers in Hagia Sophia, once again a mosque, no longer a museum, now fully a mosque. The day, not accidental, the 24th of July, was the day of the signature of the Treaty of Lausanne, when the Allies after the First World War evacuated Constantinople. And Turkey became a totally autonomous state. After the Ottoman Empire, a new state. And it's free of European influence. And this, again, symbolizes something very profound. It's about a new view of Turkey. Turkey defining itself again as a Muslim country, with Erdogan turning the building back into a mosque for prayer. And if you visit it now, there's now no entrance charge. Anyone can go in. There are carpets on the floor so that you can pray. And the Christian images have veils in front of them. And in India, the same. 6th of December 1992, we're in Ayodhya, in North India, not far from Lucknow. Ayodhya, the legendary, or possibly legendary, we don't know, birthplace of the god Ram. Rama, one of the incarnations of Vishnu. He's born in a place called Ayodhya. It's thought that it's this Ayodhya. And in Ayodhya, in the 16th century, the Mughal emperor Babur had built a great mosque, the Babri Masjid, one of the great Mughal monuments of India. On the 6th of December 1992, a Hindu mob, I think one has to call it, attacked the mosque, the mosque, because they believed it was on the site of a temple that marked the birthplace of the god Ram. And within 24 hours, they demolish the whole thing. The whole mosque is taken down and exists no more. Long debate about what would happen to it afterwards, what would happen to the site. And on the 5th of August 2020, President Modi lays the foundation stone, or the equivalent of, I'll come to that in a moment, leads the foundation ceremony of a new temple to the god Ram, built on the site of the previous mosque. The President of the secular Republic of India, secularism written into the Constitution, is performing the Bhumi Puja, depositing the silver brick. But in it, in that space you see, is water from the sacred rivers across the whole of India, and soil from various temples, again, across the whole of India, Hindu temples, Sikh gurdwaras, and Jain temples. The state is reaffirming the religious nature, the religious identity of India as what unites the whole country. And a radical shift in what it means to be Indian, or how some define what it means to be Indian. Politics in Russia, in Turkey, in India, and we'll go on. Absolutely center stage. Impossible to understand what is going on in these countries unless we take account of this. The difference from Bougainville to how to observe Ramadan in space is a global phenomenon. And it's a global phenomenon that I think raises very interesting questions for museums, because it's not just a phenomenon happening in the countries I've looked at. It's also become a central problem, a central question, a central matter of political debate inside Europe. If you went to Paris in 2017, you would have found not the usual music hall versions of what Paris in the spring might be, but you would have found this in Clichy. Large numbers of French citizens protesting about the absence of a proper mosque, a proper place of worship. Particularly problematic, of course, for France, because France, as part of its revolution, has always been extremely nervous about recognizing any community other than the community of the state. And the idea of an Islamic community is simply not sayable. This was a few weeks ago, in September this year. You're not allowed to wear an abaya now in a state school, even though an abaya is not particularly a religious form of dress. It's associated with Islam, and it is now forbidden in French state schools. The question of an Islamic community in France is an explosive one. And even in peaceful Switzerland, extraordinarily, the resistance to a new form of religious expression inside Swiss society led in 2009 to a referendum banning minarets. This minaret in Wangen was put up before. It's now illegal to put up a minaret in Switzerland. This is a very remarkable context in which to talk about faith in the public realm. And we have a public realm now where, as you know, when the debate is not properly conducted, not led in the way it might be, then matters are taken into the hands of those who feel things need to change. We all remember the Colson statue in Bristol. After years of failure to change the inscription on the plinth, eventually the public took matters into their own hands. What does this mean for the museum? Well, I think one of the great roles of the museum is that it is the place now, almost the only place now, where this debate about religion, the relationship between religions, between religion and society, can take place in a calm way. Very few of us feel at ease, going into the place of worship of a different faith. We normally feel nervous that we're going to get something wrong, or we might not be welcome, we don't know what to do. The museum is a space where those things can be debated, but that's a very, very difficult question now. And the way museums look at religious works of art and objects designed to advance the practice of faith or the observance of rituals has, I think, changed radically. And it's changed very much in my professional life. I want to take two objects from the Fitzwilliam to show what I mean. The beautiful Domenico Veneziano of the Annunciation, painted around 1445. Traditionally, what we thought our role was as curators was to explain, of course, the subject is fairly straightforward for anybody who comes from a Christian tradition, but to explain that this was part of the predella, the row of small paintings under the big altarpiece, and that this was the center one, because above this and the main altarpiece was Mary with the Christ child. And, of course, the use of perspective, the vanishing point being the door into the garden. We would, of course, say where the other panels of the predella were. I mean, the main panel is still in Florence. The other bits of the predella are in Washington and Berlin. Typical thing. That's what we thought our job was. And then, if we'd want to move forward, we'd have talked about the extraordinary power of the space between the angel and Mary. I mean, what is happening there? Because this is, of course, the center of the mystery. And in the center, at the absolute vanishing point of the composition, the door into the closed garden, the hortus conclusus of the Song of Solomon, which is, for the medieval church, the symbol of the virginity of Mary, the perpetual virginity of Mary, the closed garden. So you're looking at an image of the mystery of the virgin birth and the perpetual virginity of Mary. And that enormous space between them is, of course, the center of the composition in meaning, in terms of meaning, and above it, in the main panel, the result of this mystery, Mary and the Christ child. It would now be quite difficult just to talk about that, because what has happened very dramatically, I think, is that the focus on the individual work of art to be explored on its own has given way to a view that works of art, objects, are also part of a wider narrative of questions of importance to us now. The Black Atlantic exhibition at Fitzwilliam at the moment is an excellent example. The great pictures, some of them in it, are not there particularly as great pictures, but as part of a wider narrative about the question of the relationship between slavery and the Fitzwilliam, slavery and British society. And here, this kind of subject now raises all kinds of questions about female empowerment. Was Mary able to say no? Could Mary have said no? are we looking at the moment at which the whole history of salvation could have changed? And what does it say about women and the role of women? All kinds of other questions would now come into it, and what is Domenico Veneziano's position on these questions? This is, of course, the central moment of the Christian notion of salvation. But also in the Fitzwilliam is one of the great Old Testament scenes. And I use Old Testament because this is, from a Christian point of view, this is Poussin's painting of Eliezer and Rebecca, painted about 1655 in Rome by Nicolas Poussin. And Abraham, remember, sends his messenger, Eliezer, to look for a wife for Isaac. And Rebecca draws water for his camels and gives him water for the camels, and he realizes that this is the bride of Isaac that he has been seeking. And he gives her jewelry. And for the medieval church, this is a prefiguration of the Annunciation. The messenger of Abraham, Eliezer, is like the messenger of God, Gabriel. Rebecca is a prefiguration of the Virgin. She's going to be the mother of course, the line that eventually leads to Jesus. And again, this would have been looked at, we'd have looked at it very much originally in terms of the way it sat in Poussin's career and the balance of composition. But how do we take it into the bigger question of what would now be the Christian reading of the Old Testament, the turning around of scriptures to make them mean something that they certainly didn't mean to those who wrote them, we imagine, and still don't mean to Jewish readers of those scriptures. How you address this kind of picture has changed, and necessarily so. That's the broad background, and these are quite easy subjects. But if we're staying with Poussin, I want to look at a very problematic subject, an early work of the mid-1620s, which is now in the Pushkin Museum in Moscow. And it's again from the Hebrew Scriptures, from the Old Testament, it's Joshua conquering the Amorites at Gibeon. He paints it around 1626, so it's about 30 years before the one we've just looked at. And it's one of a pair, Joshua's victory over the Amalekites in the Hermitage. You can see that they are conceived as a pair. The one on the left, all the movement runs down into the center. The one on the right, the movement runs the other way. They're clearly meant to be looked at like this. And there are two great moments of the victories of the Israelites over those who opposed their move into the Promised Land. Traditionally, we would have pointed out that what is behind these, the composition, this wonderful, turbulent composition, it's clear that Poussin has looked at Roman sarcophagi. He's in Rome, and this is a Roman sarcophagus now in the British Museum of the battle of Greeks and the Amazons, or is it the Lapis and the Centaurs? We don't know. What it is about, as I say, is that there are the good guys, us, the Greeks, and the others who are a danger, Amazons or Centaurs. And that, of course, is exactly what the Poussin is about as well. The Amorites are the threat, the danger. God is on our side. And he is eager to keep the references to antique sculpture because he wants to show that he knows he's putting this back into into antiquity. So if you look at the figure on the left, the naked man striding forward with the horse, you can see, I think, that he comes almost exactly from the Dioscuri, the horse tamers, the great famous antique statue at the foot of the Capitoline Hill. Rather irritatingly, the man that took the photograph of the sculpture didn't really think enough about the Poussin, because if he moved a little bit further left, you would get almost exactly the same lineup. And it's clear that's what Poussin has done. And here, then, we have the moment when the Israelites are smiting the Amorites, and the sun and the moon stand still until the work is done. And God sends hailstones, huge hailstones, bottom right, which kill more than even the Israelites. This is one of the most brutal passages of the Old Testament. It is in the text of Deuteronomy, in the text of Joshua, constantly enjoined that the people of God should kill and show no mercy. No covenant, no mercy. The people, the Amorites, and all the others have to be driven out. What do you do with this now? How do you exhibit in a world where nobody knows very much about the history? What do you put on the label? If this is your picture, what do you put on the label? Here you see the Israelites, the people of God, killing their enemies, instructed by the God of Abraham and of Isaac and of Jacob to show no mercy, to exterminate them. What do you do with that kind of picture? And what do you say about it? Given we all know how you could read that at the moment, from both sides, the people of God feeling that they want to, some of them, exterminate and show no mercy. And here is a text, and here is an image. Do you show it at all? Is it responsible to show it? And if you do show it, what do you say about it? I'd like to know, if we have time, I'd like to know how you would deal with that. But this is now the question that arises again and again, as religion has again become such a strong political force. What you show and what you say about it is a very difficult and dangerous question. And that is the role of the curator. And these are in public institutions. I've deliberately chosen ones in Moscow and Petersburg because they're not our responsibility. But they might be, and there are other ones I could show and I'm about to show, which are. And this is new. And thinking of the Woolf Institute, the relationship between religion and society, how you have a better kind of debate, better discourse. These questions are, I think, very unsettling. There's an even more complicated one, and it's, again, about what you show and what you don't show. The next slide will show another great battle at a formative stage of religious history. It's the Battle of Badr, 624 in our calendar, where Muhammad and the companions of Muhammad defeat the Quraysh. Muhammad has fled to Medina. There's the fight between his companions, his followers, and the people of Medina. And this is the battle, a very decisive battle described in some detail. And it's as rough a battle, more or less, as the ones we've just seen. There is in the British Museum an illuminated manuscript of this scene, because in the 16th century, a magnificent Ottoman series of illustrations to life of the Prophet was commissioned by the Caliph, by the Sultan, in Istanbul. And at this date, it's perfectly normal to show the figure of the Prophet, not the face of the Prophet. So you can show the Prophet as being present, but you can't see his identity, and you're not pretending that you are showing the face of the Prophet. I would like to show it to you, but I need to ask first whether anybody would object to that, because if not, we can skip very quickly on. Because it's, again, one of these really key questions which has become an absolutely central one. So if nobody puts their hand up, nobody is objecting, then this is it. The we're told in the Quran that this is the day of the criterion, and that Muhammad prayed in a shelter. The Prophet prayed in a shelter nearby as his companions led the fight that was the victory. And here you see Muhammad praying and veiled. Now there are more severe, many Muslims and many Muslim scholars and commentators have no difficulty with this long-standing tradition, which is followed in Ottoman and in Persian works over many centuries. Some take a more severe, more rigorous view, that any image of the Prophet ought not be shown. If you are running a museum, do you show this? This is part of a long tradition that shapes the thinking of Middle Eastern Islam in over many centuries, and is how these events are visualized. There are parts of the Islamic tradition that would no longer welcome this. As a curator, what do you do? Do you show it? What do you say about it? Do you show it on the wall? Do you show it online? I would like to know. These are very, very big questions. And they're new questions. And I can't pretend to an answer to any of these. But they've all become, as you know as well as I, acute in a way that was almost unimaginable 20 years ago. The other question about what can be shown, what cannot be shown, is of course very strongly present when we come to the religions and the faith traditions, which have large numbers of objects which can be seen only by certain people or not at all. That's particularly, of course, the indigenous faith systems of peoples, especially in America, Africa, and Oceania. And it raises the further question about the artifacts in the museum. These are two poles, commonly called totem poles, from the northwest coast of Canada. And they carry imagery of the ancestry, the animals and the spirits that are the protective forces of a particular part of the community. They were exhibited publicly, but these two were acquired in the context of the prohibition of potlatches, the great ceremonies where much wealth and food was destroyed or given away, to show the power of the community, which was prohibited by the government in the early 20th century, the government of Canada. And there's no problem about them being shown, but the question is who is allowed to talk about them? And this is a very, very major question. Until, I think it's fair to say, 20 years ago, broadly, any scholar who had worked on this field, who had spent time there, studied the literature, it would have been thought that they were properly qualified, equipped, and entitled to talk about the work. There's a growing view that that's not the case. There's no problem with British Museum. There was no problem with these poles. One of the elders of the community from whom they came, for whom they still have significance, came to perform prayers in the British Museum about the poles, and expressed his delight on behalf of his community that they were seen in the context of world cultures, and that people from all around the world could see how the Haida people, in the case of this pole, of northwest Pacific coast of Canada, understood the world and gave it visual form. But this is, again, a very, very sensitive issue. It is almost impossible now, I think, in an Australian museum, to address the question of Aboriginal religious artefacts without close collaboration with a person of Aboriginal descent. And that is largely true also in North America. And I think we can all understand that. Can any of us, coming out of, most of us out of written traditions of highly regularized, highly formalized forms of worship with texts, can we understand a totally different starting point, a totally different view of the world, a different apprehension of the divine in every aspect of the world, from a very different one from the one that the Abrahamic tradition presents to us? And it's now a great question for every curator. If you have material of this sort, how do you ensure that it is spoken about in a way that is appropriate and not just understanding, but respectful, but also able to explain to somebody like me, who comes from the Abrahamic traditions, what view of the divine in the cosmos and the relation between the divine, the animal, the human, and the natural world, how that is perceived. And here we hit a major Enlightenment question. The Enlightenment assumption is, I think it's fair to say, that everybody is entitled to look at any evidence, pursue rationally the investigation of any object and any behavior. If the cultures from which these objects come do not believe they should be seen by women or by people who are not elders of the community or whatever, or by nobody, is it proper for us to show them, to investigate them, even if there's no question of asking for a return, which is usually the case? And none of these questions arise in this particular instance, because obviously I don't want to show you objects for which that might be. But this is a radical shift from the basis on which all European museums were created, the Enlightenment model of unfettered investigation, and particularly investigation unfettered by religion. The whole point of the Enlightenment in these terms is, of course, to be able to investigate free from the constraints of the Christian church, free from religious constraints. Where does that leave us confronting this material? There are many people at the Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology in Cambridge better equipped than I to talk about it. But it is a central problem, and in some measure, a relatively new one. It takes us to the very point of the museum and the tradition we're in. And broadly, there are two museum traditions in relation to faith. There's, as you'd expect, the French and the British. And as you'd expect, they are different, indeed radically different. The French museum tradition really begins, to make a completely wide-sweeping remark, on the 10th of August, 1793. That is the day of the great Republican feast festival tradition of unity and reunion. And the public proceed from the Bastille to the Champ de Mars, and they stop on the way at the Fountain of Regeneration. And the 10th of August 1793, the king had been deposed a year before. This is the new republic, and the festival is going to be part of the creation of a new kind of France, a new citizen, regenerated on grounds of reason. Church, of course, has been swept away. All the constraints of traditional Catholic belief have been removed. Reason and equality will create the new regenerated France. And on the same day, the Louvre opens its doors as a museum to everybody. The permanent expression of this momentary ritual of the great festival. And the Louvre becomes a very particular kind of museum. This is the Grande Galerie, previously reserved, of course, for VIPs, now open to everybody. And here are hung not just the pictures that were in the royal collection, some of which would have been there before, but the pictures which have been taken from the aristocrats and, of course, from the church. And this is the point at which art in the museum and faith in the museum become very problematic. Obviously, the new government wants every citizen to be able to see the greatest works of art. That is self-evident. The problem is that many of the greatest works of art are religious works of art that are making propaganda for the very church you've just abolished, and for the church which you don't want to play any part in the regenerated new nation. So what do? How do you show the work of art without focusing on the message? And the position becomes a very remarkable one and a very extreme one. This is an example of one of the walls with Raphael's. This is later, of course, when the pictures have been brought from all over Europe after the conquests of the revolutionary armies and the Napoleonic armies, the pillaging of the collections of Europe, the central figure, the Raphael Transfiguration from the Vatican. And what is done now is that the picture is shown only as a work of art. It has no meaning in terms of its subject. What it's about is the human progression of an artist and how art develops. You exhibit these as specimens of artistic excellence, and you exhibit them chronologically and by national school. And what you're looking at is how art develops, how does composition change, how does perspective develop, all these things. And what does Raphael do? All these are by Raphael. So you're looking at Raphael is the center point. You're looking at this not because you're interested in the Transfiguration and Jesus as the healer coming down from the mountain, having been with Moses and Elijah. You're looking at it as a work by Raphael. And Raphael is the central figure. Raphael is, if you like, the saint. The artist has become the saint. The artist has displaced the subject. And they're organized by nationality. It's the most radical turnaround you can imagine. And you never talk about the subject. You talk about color, composition, whatever, figure drawing. The British Museum is on a very different basis. It's already been going for 40 years by this time. And its purpose is actually completely different. It is partly to look at religion, but to look at different religions. And one of the purposes from the beginning is to collect evidences of different religions, different faith practices from around the world so that you can compare. And the hope is that that will lead to tolerance. So you have a Buddhist, this is of course not particular images, but you can see the point. And again, the opposite of the Louvre position. Religion is what these are about. And you think about how people have understood the divine themselves and the relation to the divine. So the work can retain some kind of religious aura as it comes into the museum. And indeed, one of the striking things about the museum, even today, is that particularly in front of images like the one on the right, we quite often find offerings. When Ganesh was shown in Oxford not long ago in the City Museum, people were making offerings as a Hindu normally would, to make the offering of flowers or fruit to the god. It can be a museum object for those who do not come from that tradition. It can be an object of veneration and worship. The French position and the British tradition, radically different. And the Germans, caught in the middle. The Humboldt Forum, which opened recently, reconstructed the Baroque palace of the Hohenzollerns, built about 1710, reconstructed it completely. And part of that is now a museum of works mostly from America, Africa, and Oceania. But part of the reconstruction was to put back on the top the cross that had been there in the 19th century over the Royal Chapel. huge debate in Germany about whether it was possible to show, or respectful to show, Hindu Buddhist works in a building with a cross on top. Great debates about what should be on top. As you can see, various proposals. But ultimately it was decided that the historic reconstruction had been decided by Parliament, by the Bundestag, and should go ahead. But that divide between the two between the British and the French tradition is, I think, a very clear one. And it matters very much when you're talking about what you do when you show a religious object. How can you show faith? Can you? Or can you show only the objects which are ancillary to faith? And how do you do that? The French tradition is actually best seen in the Louvre Abu Dhabi, this wonderful building you can see on the screen now, which opened a few years ago. And here you can see how they've presented it. You have a Virgin and Child on the left, you have a Bodhisattva on the right, two figures who help the human towards the divine, in some sense intermediaries. And in the middle, a text, an Islamic text, and on the wall, an Islamic text. It's interesting that the three visitors are photographing the text. And it shows, I think, immediately one of the problems of trying to show a faith when the Christian and the Buddhist tradition have imagery and the Islamic tradition does not. How do you do that in any sense with equality? Can it be done? And how do you manage that built-in problem of the aniconic traditions from those that have very rich figurative traditions? When the British Museum tried with the Berlin joint exhibition in 2015 about the three Abrahamic faiths in Egypt after the pharaohs, it became very clear that it was hard to do anything other than texts. So we had a Hebrew text, but a Hebrew text showing the influence of decorative script from contemporary Qurans, so in some way a suggestion of connection between the different faiths. The Codex Sinaiticus, the very early New Testament from Sinai, and then a magnificent Kufic Quran from the 8th century. And this talks about Jesus as a prophet. But for most of our visitors, this was completely inaccessible, of course. Without a label telling you what's going on, the fact that you've got three different kinds of manuscripts, three different kinds of writing, it doesn't do very much. It is very, very hard. And it comes right to the heart of the problem. Can you show a faith in a museum? How do you show what people do and why they do it? Or are you going to stay simply with the object, the beautiful thing, which you discuss in the French tradition as the thing in itself? I want to argue that if you're going to fulfill the role of the museum to be a place where these conversations happen, you need to address somehow what it means to hold a faith. And it's more important than ever that we should try to understand that for the reasons which I gave at the beginning. We have to try to understand how other people imagine their relationship with the divine and how that's exercised. And that leads to a very interesting and difficult kind of curatorial problem. This is the poster for the exhibition the British Museum did on Hajj a few years ago. We chose Hajj because the pilgrimage to Mecca is the only one of the pillars of Islam which non-Muslims cannot see. The other pillars we can watch and in some measure take part in, not Hajj. But Hajj is, of course, one of the strongest factors in creating a global sense of what it means to be a Muslim and of a global community of faith in Islam. So to try to explain what goes on when Muslims make Hajj and circumambulate the Kaaba and the other perform the other rites, rituals that are performed in Hajj, and why it matters. Because this, I think, is, many British people take part in this. It's part of our citizens' cultures. And it shows, I think, this slide, just how difficult this is. What you have, the main object, what a museum would focus on, the mahmal, is the canopy that sits over the Quran as it's carried from Cairo or from Istanbul to Mecca. Every year they're sent. They were sent particularly from Cairo, and they travel on a camel, the Quran, inside this mahmal. And that tells you something very important, and it's a wonderful museum object. But as you can see, what's required to make sense of it is both the big photograph behind, not a normal museum object, and indeed the video on the bottom right. You can really only address these questions if you go beyond the normal museum discipline of telling from objects. And then the question is, are we a secular space? To what extent can we allow religious practice in a secular space open to all? The public was very varied. There was very large Muslim visitation, and we felt that it was important that there should be somewhere, because the exhibition was open all day, where people could pray. So the museum created a space for prayer so that visitors could observe their prayer obligations. Is that a proper thing to do for a secular organisation? The Louvre colleagues were horrified, absolutely horrified. I don't know what you think about that, but it's one of the questions that arises if we're going to understand why it is that faith is not about individual salvation, but about the basis of a community. And that's what I think we have to try to understand. And that's the real challenge. Why do people feel, what is the role of faith in making a community? So after, as well as Hajj, we decided we would try to do the same for the Hindu, for the Hindu tradition, by setting up in the Great Court the image of Durga for the great Bengal festival of Durga Puja. Once a year in the Hindu tradition, the goddess Durga, who is the great female goddess, was given all power so that she can overcome evil that men on their own can't do. Once a year, she visits the world, which in this case really means Bengal, especially Calcutta, stays for a few days and then leaves. Every year, an image of the goddess overcoming the demon is made. And it's made in a very particular way. So we brought craftsmen from West Bengal, from Calcutta, because for this image to achieve its purpose, you need to have, it's basically straw with clay and earth that comes from every part of the community. All over Calcutta, different communities build their own Durga. They're huge, and there's great competition between the different bits of the city. But to make the image, you need earth and clay from every part of your community, so that the whole community is present. You need dust from a prostitute's house, you need something from the priest's house, and you need mud from the banks of the Ganges. And only when the whole community is physically gathered through its earth material can the goddess inhabit the image. And that will happen when her eyes are painted in, and she will spend a few days, and always in the street, not in the temples. There's no caste restrictions. It's in the street. Everybody can go. And although it's a Hindu ritual, there are regular attendances by Muslim groups, Christian groups, for prayer or whatever, as with Ganesh in Mumbai. It's a marvelous bit of poetic theology, of social theology for a whole community, a physical expression in the image. She's worshipped for a few days. These are the London public hearing a talk about it. And Again, we decided we should not have worship carried out in the museum, that the object could be there, but the pujas should take place somewhere else. But then at the end of the few days, when the goddess leaves, the image is taken away and disposed of, so that every year you have to remake your notion of the divine. And every year you start again to think how you will represent what you put in front of it. The image itself is taken away and has to be disposed of in the Ganges. Luckily, like all great religions, Hinduism can transform reality, and any nearby river can, for these purposes, be the Ganges. So this is the Ganges at Putney Bridge, and as it happened, the rainbow came out on cue. These are the kinds of questions I think we need to ask ourselves. How far can you go? I believe that this is an essential part of what a museum should now be trying to do, to explain why faith builds communities and therefore why it matters so much. But that takes us always to the edge of proselytizing, of using a secular space for a religious purpose. I don't know what you think about that. But I want to finish with a totally different tradition, the Indian tradition. This is the museum in Mumbai. It was called the Prince of Wales Museum. It's now called the Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj Vasti Sangrahalaya, which is the Chhatrapati Shivaji is the great Hindu warrior of the 17th century and a local hero. In its centre, it's this beautiful building of about 1910, as you can see. And in the rotunda, which you see beyond, we're about to embark on a major project called Of Ancient Worlds Now, to try to bring to India, on long-term loan from the British Museum and Berlin, some of the gods of Egypt, Greece, and Rome. All Indian students study Egypt, Greece, and Rome. In Indian museums, there are no objects from those cultures. So the idea is long-term loan so that schools and universities can actually teach from the objects in situ. And the Getty is very generously funding it. And the academic side is now, I'm glad to say, part of the Global Humanities project in Cambridge. And here, the relationship between the divine and the everyday, the secular, the religious and the profane, is very different. There is really no barrier at all. What will be coming here are, say, gods of Egypt, Greece, and Rome. And the middle will be this wonderful object. You can see its scale. A boar is being unpacked. And it represents another incarnation of the god Vishnu, the boar Varaha. Vishnu takes living form at regular intervals to rescue the world. The world keeps getting into a mess. The god has to come and do something. And this is the third incarnation, Varaha's the boar, where the world has been drowned in the cosmic ocean. And the boar comes and rescues Bhudevi, the figure by its side, with his tusk, and pulls her back out of the water and restores humanity and the earth to its proper place. And the whole body of the boar, as you see, is covered with narrative stories. This is really the emblem, a whole narrative of salvation of the world by the god, on this occasion in the form of a boar, and on his snout is the goddess Saraswati, the goddess of wisdom. It is divine wisdom that intervenes regularly to rescue the world. A wonderful image, with which I certainly wasn't familiar before, but I think is quite easy to understand once one's told, and that in our museums would be shown appropriately, but as an object. But in India, this is, after all, an image of a god who is revered and venerated. And so, as he's unpacked, he has to be honoured as a guest with the garland. And in front of him, a coconut has to be broken to mark the arrival of the god and the beginning of a new moment. The division between the museum and the temple doesn't exist. The visitors will regard this, of course, as a work of art. That's how it will be talked about as well. But they will also venerate it and respond to it as an image of a god. And here we hit a really fascinating narrative problem, I think, or ethical problem in India that has resonance for us about faith in the museum. The Indian gods, the traditional gods, here you see the goddess of the Ganges, Ganga, the divine river, which is the river of life, and which will wash away sin, particularly if you die in Varanasi. Here is the goddess Ganga, still venerated as a goddess. We're bringing from the British Museum Hapi, the god of the flooding of the Nile, venerated by the Egyptians as divine, the source of life. But a big question, how do you exhibit a dead god respectfully or properly beside a god who is still alive and still venerated? And one of the big questions that we've been working with Indian visitors, the question for them is, how can a god die? Indian gods don't die. So what is the status of Hapi? Why is he no longer venerated? Why is he just a statue? A totally different discussion about faith and society and the changes in them. And even greater puzzlement about the Greek gods, who are simply beautiful human beings. Apollo here, how do you know this is a divine figure? And Aphrodite from Berlin, they're on their way there at the moment. The questions showing photographs, how do you know this is a god? It's simply a human being. And whereas all our gods look at us, and that's how we know we're in touch with them, these gods don't. How do they know we're here? And the question that is always about, where do I make my offering? And you realize the extent to which we've stopped thinking of these completely as religious objects. We've turned them into aesthetic objects, part of a visual tradition, and that dimension has been removed. And one of the great excitements of this whole project has been for the curators here and in Berlin to rediscover the questions that these are religious objects. And what does that mean if you think about them, not just as aesthetic objects, but as religious objects? The Indian colleagues became very interested in the survival of these, the argument that the West still worships these gods, but in a completely different way, because they've become, of course, the ideals of the human body that everyone wants to aspire to. And of course, this Venus, the Aphrodite from Berlin, as you look at the pose, is of course exactly the same pose as the Venus you all know. And everybody under a certain age wants to look either like Apollo or Aphrodite. They were very struck by the fact that, in a sense, the cult of the gods goes on. Lastly, the challenge. And I think the challenge for us all in museums, and I want to finish on a Christian art subject and paintings, two paintings in the National Gallery. It's the Titian, Bacchus and Ariadne. The story, remember, Ariadne has been ditched by Theseus. She's helped him kill the Minotaur. She's helped him escape. And he then dumps her on Naxos, and she's left alone. And then Bacchus arrives on his way back from India, and they become a couple, and she's then turned into the constellation you see above. Despondent, and a god arrives. What is extraordinary, I think, about this picture, the god bringing all the jollity, all the reassurance, all the happiness that Ariadne actually does, is that when we work with even school groups in the gallery, everybody can eventually work out what is going on. That unhappiness, loneliness, abandonment is healed by divine joy. And that can move people even without any belief in the divinity of Bacchus or the authenticity of the story. It speaks to everybody as part of their experience. And if not their experience, they certainly know people who've had this experience. A few years later, Titian paints the Jesus appearing to the Magdalene on Easter morning. And at one level, this is the same story. A woman abandoned, desolate, in despair, meets the divine, and everything changes. But it's impossible for most visitors to engage with this, because this is a Christian story, and it's a Christian story that, for most of our visitors, is rejected as not true, because it's presented by the Christian Church as historical fact, the resurrection, the meeting with Mary Magdalene, and it's the moment at which he tells her not to touch him because he's not yet ascended. The most beautiful image of yearning, of longing on her part, and of protective love on his part. And it's got a very important role in the museum, in the history of the gallery, and the relationship between religion and society. In 1939, when war broke out, all the old master pictures were taken out of the gallery and sent off to a quarry in Wales. The public eventually complained bitterly and asked that some pictures come back so that they could see them. The trustees decided one picture could come back every month, and they consulted the public about what they wanted. And in January 1942, one of the lowest points of the war, Singapore had just fallen, Japan had entered the war, all the rest of it, this is the picture that the public asked for. And I think that's very, very significant, because it clearly is about death, about loss, about hope, about love, love beyond death. And it clearly spoke at that stage at a level, clearly a lot of the public would have been Christian, but many not. And I think this is one of our tasks, is can we present moments like this from the Christian narrative as myth, like the Bacchus and Ariadne, that's available to everybody. Not necessarily an event that happened once, but a constant of human experience, and that can be engaged with by people without faith, because it's about the central truth of experience which the particular narrative carries. That challenge is really where I want to leave you. Can we move from these images as literal, if you like, illustrations of a particular text to myth that is available to everybody? Because that, I think, allows a different kind of engagement of the public with the religious art, a different role for faith in the museum. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for this amazing talk. It reminded me, we had a talk last year where Baroness Hale, who's one of our trustees, talked us through what it means to be a lawyer, and after her talk we really understood what it means to be a judge. And today I think you took us on this journey, what it means to be an art historian, to be a curator, lots of questions, so thank you so much for giving us this insight. And very kindly, our speaker has agreed to answer some questions. Our microphones to pass around don't seem to work, but if there are questions, a person could stand up and perhaps project into the room.
Yeah. Hello. First of all, thank you for an absolutely wonderful, wonderful talk. My question slightly relates to what you were saying about the beginning, about geopolitics, I suppose, and religion. My memory of the Hajj exhibition is that there was a big controversy over the role of Saudi Arabia and what Saudi Arabia had done to Mecca and what Saudi involvement had been with the exhibition and the plan. Was it funding? I can't remember. But yeah, does that sort of thing happen a lot when you're talking about how museums deal with religion? Is there a political...
Absolutely. And no, thank you for raising that. It's another one of those very, very thorny, difficult questions for the curator. Clearly, we couldn't do an exhibition about Hajj without the cooperation of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. The King of Saudi Arabia is the guardian of the two holy places, and we wanted to be able to show images and bring objects from Mecca. They obviously have their particular view of how Mecca, buildings in Mecca should be treated. The great row, you may remember, was that whether buildings which were thought to be connected to either the Prophet or the family of the Prophet, whether they should be left as places to be revered or whether they should be demolished, and whether they had been demolished, and so on. And it was a very delicate conversation, because obviously the academic integrity, intellectual integrity of the exhibition has to be protected, but the whole exhibition depends on finding language, finding a way through that is acceptable, in this case, to the Saudi Arabian authorities. The same is true in every time you attempt to do an exhibition about the practice of a faith, a living faith, with the Durga Puja, working with Hindu communities in London. How far is the narrative, because their view of the narrative might not, of course, be the same as the view of the academic curators. In each case, of course, we worked with curators, both who were from the faith and not, scholars from outside the faith tradition and scholars in it. But it's one of the most delicate negotiations. In a normal exhibition, the difficulties are whether you can borrow the objects at all, or there may be political problems, let's say with China, about what China is prepared to lend, or what you're allowed to say about objects, or how you refer, let's say, to Taiwan or to Tibet. Those are very difficult conversations, but the religious ones are of a different order. And if the museum is to try to address, as I think it must, the question of what it means for faith to be practiced by a community, then those tight ropes have to be walked. And there will always clearly be, there's no right answer, there will always be criticism. And the museum was criticised for not showing photographs before the demolition of some of those buildings. And that's a perfectly proper view to be held. So that's another real problem.
With regards to the last image that you showed, and you said, can we move from art as a literal interpretation of the text into something that illustrates a universal myth that we can all identify with? In much of the traditional art, these two cannot be separated, that the symbol and the symbolized are not two realities, but are one reality. Much of the traditional art is presented in that context. Is that something that you do, or you try to do?
Yes, I mean, you're absolutely right, of course. And it's to some extent, it's an anachronistic polarity. And it's a polarity of the secular world, of the post-Enlightenment world. It's very striking in the Black Atlantic exhibition at Fitzwilliam. The labels are all written in the present tense. That's a very powerful thing, because it's suggesting, so that you're talking about a person. It says, he does such and such, he comes to Cambridge, he does so, but it's as though this is happening now. And that's a very, very powerful way of making the point that what you're looking at in the image is about something that still has resonance today. But you're absolutely right. For most of the lifetime of those objects, and certainly at the time they were made, the Christian imagery, they would always have been seen as both of the moment and for beyond. When Poussin is painting those battles, at that stage, in the 17th century, the battles of Joshua are seen as emblematic of the forces of God defeating the forces of evil. And commentators point out that Joshua is the same name as Jesus. So you're looking at, that's how it's to be read. And of course, at that stage, nobody's thinking really of the land of Israel or Palestine. The enemies that you're destroying are either the Turks, of course God obviously wants you to destroy the Turks, but even more is probably the Protestants. And there, obviously, God doesn't want you to show any mercy at all. So you're absolutely right. I mean, they would have been read, those images particularly, would have been read in the 17th century, in the 1620s when they're painted, almost certainly as contemporary, and not really as historic images in that sense. That's very hard to communicate, of course. And that's why I think it's so problematic that we've lost that habit of reading on different levels simultaneously. But thank you.
Coming to the end of our time, I think we have one more short question.
Shall I just speak without everything? And what I want to say, I want to pick up on that.
I think standing up always
I just want to pick up on that particular point. How far can you actually amend, or should we say, design, write your captions so that they have the kind of content that you're exactly explaining to us?
You can't. That is the whole problem. So the question is, how can you write, in case you didn't hear, and how can you write the captions to make all these points? The problem is that people stop reading after a certain point. And that's why it is so difficult. The sound guide has come to our aid, of course. That helps a great deal because people will listen longer, or you're going to have more words listening as you look. But it is precisely the problem that the reading of these objects is so complex that it's very, very hard to carry it in labels. And no, thank you. It's the challenge. By writing the labels is always the most difficult thing, and there's usually a word limit. Have we time for one more?
Okay.
Yes,
very last question.
One more question. In Glasgow, the criteria is an 8-year-old child has to be able to understand the label. That is Glasgow Museum's policy.
Yes, the Glasgow Museum, the label should be written for 8-year-olds. At the British Museum, we aimed at 12. But 12-year-olds of all ages. And I don't know whether you've done this, but when I was doing labels, I used to go regularly to the geology section of the Science Museum. I know nothing. I don't know the difference between a quartz and a feldspar, all these things. And it's really interesting in a discipline you know nothing about to read a label and see what you can take from it. And how difficult it is when you know something to write, to remember what it's like, not to know anything. So, but I think an 8-year-old is, for most of us, in most of the disciplines, we're 8. So, thank you very much. Thank you.